I guess some of you maybe looked at the sermon title this morning and were thinking, Occupy Jesus. I don't know exactly what he's going to be talking about. Maybe you were thinking, Jesus is a little bored and we have to kind of keep him occupied. Hey, Jesus, want to play some cribbage? That'll put in some time, But that's not the Occupy that we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is the way that we see Jesus, and maybe the way that we see Jesus that has changed over the years to suit our purposes. What do you think about when you think about Jesus? What do you see? Who do you see when you see Jesus? We are still in the season of Easter, and we are in the lectionary looking at those familiar stories of post-mortem appearances of Jesus to his disciples. Last week to the disciples and to Thomas, and this week on the road to Emmaus, an appearance to Cleopas and another unnamed follower, walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, a distance of about 7 miles or 11 kilometers. This stranger comes alongside, walks with them for about 11 kilometers, for about 2 hours or more. They're walking with this stranger, and yet they do not recognize him. It's remarkable because according to the early traditions of the church, Cleopas was actually Jesus' uncle. He was the brother of Joseph, the carpenter. And it's kind of strange, don't you think, that Jesus' uncle wouldn't recognize him after walking for 2 hours with him. And at least one other tradition in the early church identifies that other unnamed follower as Nathanael, that same Nathanael that we read about in our other passage. So someone who had been with Jesus for 3 years or more, and yet they don't recognize him. So think about those appearances of Jesus after Easter, and how many times he is actually not recognized. Mary in the garden, the disciples fishing just offshore, only a short distance away, and the road to Emmaus. There are times when Jesus is recognized, but then there are these times when he's not, or maybe he's recognized after a short while or a moment of confusion. And I suppose there might be many reasons for that. But I wonder in these stories if maybe there is a subtle message from the writers, something about the way that we see Jesus. Because the truth is that we see the Jesus we want to see. Maybe we always have, and maybe we still do. Mary saw a gardener. The disciples, including Peter, saw someone offering unsolicited fishing tips from shore. The followers on the road to Emmaus walked for 11 kilometers with a stranger who seemed to be completely unaware of all of the turmoil that had just happened in Jerusalem. We see the Jesus that we want to see. Think back to that earlier passage from the Gospel of John. John the Baptist saw the Lamb of God. Those followers who were followers of John heard what John said, and they saw a rabbi, although apparently Jesus had no formal religious training. They saw a rabbi. Philip saw the Messiah. Nathanael saw a case of mistaken identity, or maybe fraud. Can anything good come from Nazareth? We see the Jesus that we want to see. And think also about how many times it seems that Jesus doesn't allow himself to be drawn into how someone sees him when people specifically ask him about his identity. Jesus, tell us, are you Elijah? Are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, who do you say I am? When the religious and political officials question him, are you the Messiah, Jesus? Tell us, are you the Son of God? You say so. Jesus refuses to allow himself to be drawn into the way that we want to see him. Maybe that's the way it always was, and maybe that's the way it still is. Because we, I think, see the Jesus that we want to see too. That raises a lot of questions. Because how do we see Jesus 2,000 years later in North America? And how is that maybe different from the Jesus who really existed in Palestine? What can we know about the real Jesus? Well, I'll tell you one thing right off the bat. I think one of the things that we miss here in this very privileged part of the world 2,000 years later is just how radical and how revolutionary Jesus was. We are talking about a man, and just a few weeks ago we observed the Christian feast that marks his crucifixion. Crucifixion by the Roman authorities. Now, you've got to know something about crucifixion. Crucifixion was not handed out lightly. It was only delivered as a sentence for non-Roman citizens, and only in 3 situations. Runaway slaves were crucified. Bandits and pirates were crucified. And those accused of sedition, of inciting people to rebel and overthrow authority. Well, Jesus wasn't a runaway slave, and he wasn't a bandit as far as we know. So that leaves one option. But you know, isn't it interesting that here in North America today, we hardly ever see Jesus as political. The fact is that Jesus was killed because he was considered a political threat to the governing authorities. The Romans really did not care about Jewish religious squabbles. They were very practical people. In spite of what it says in the Gospels, they would not have been persuaded by the Sanhedrin over a minor religious disagreement to crucify someone. The Roman state killed Jesus because he was considered a revolutionary threat. We see the Jesus we want to see. We don't talk much about that Jesus, do we? We don't talk much about how Jesus taught his disciples, how he taught his followers, the way that he was explaining to them. We don't talk about that in real terms, as the people of that day would have heard it. And clearly they did hear it, because we know that countless early Christians were also put to death by crucifixion, including Peter and Andrew, Saint Andrew, crucified by the Roman state, and we know why the Romans crucified people, don't we? The fact is that for years after Jesus' death, the Romans considered Christians a real threat. Now, we sometimes explain that away because we say, well, Christians wouldn't sacrifice to the Roman gods. But again, the Romans were a very practical people. They had all sorts of exemptions for people who had peculiar religious beliefs. Among them were the Jewish people. The Romans understood, well, look, the Jewish people are a little bit funny about making sacrifices. They have particular ideas about their gods, so we're going to give them an exemption. They won't have to sacrifice to our gods. They could have done the same things for Christians, but they didn't, because they wanted Christians identified. They wanted Christians identified because for some reason they saw Christians as a threat. And that was the state of affairs for about 300 years. Until Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, whose mother, Helena, was a Christian, converted himself to Christianity in 312. And Christianity received an edict of toleration in the Roman Empire. And then in 380, something else happened. Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the only state religion in the Roman Empire. In some ways, we look at that as a triumph. But you know, I think in many ways it was a tragedy, because it was the end of that message that Jesus taught. What happened to that original message of Christ is that it became co-opted by the Roman Empire, and suddenly it was very advantageous to be a Christian. It wasn't dangerous at all to be a Christian. Being a Christian meant that you were the right kind of person, that you could hold the right kind of job in civil society. And that continued for centuries, didn't it? Christ became a tool. Christ, this radical who was crucified for sedition, became a tool for keeping people in line. Christ became an instrument of the state. And we go along for a few hundred years, and then we come to the Protestant Reformation. And we say, well, let's get back to that original message of Christ. And a very interesting thing happens. We do for a while. People start reading the Gospels, and they start seeing this radical, this revolutionary, and they say, who is this? This isn't somebody that we've heard about in our churches. And a very interesting thing happens, because if you look at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, it is marked by all kinds of movements for economic and political and social justice. Movements that would seem more in place in the 1960s than in the late 1500s. As people discover the real Jesus. And that lasted for a few years, until the leaders of the Protestant Reformation said, whoa, 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 wait a minute, we've got to put the lid back on this thing. We don't want people to get too carried away and start taking Jesus too seriously. We have tamed Jesus in this privileged part of the world. We have told ourselves a narrative of alternative history. We have turned Jesus into a nice moral teacher, a civil Jesus. And we have glossed over the radicality of Jesus. And in many ways, not always, but in many ways, we proclaim a Jesus that has nothing to do with the kind of things that Jesus was actually talking about, and the kind of way that Jesus wanted to teach his followers. Just a month or two ago, there was an article in Christianity that said, you know what? Christianity Today, I believe. No, I'm sorry, Sojourners magazine. And it said, the Jesus of North American Christianity today resembles nothing of the Jesus of history. Now, this is a hard message today. This is a hard message, but this is a message that we need to hear. We can think what we like about what Jesus said, about what his message was. We can tell ourselves that it wasn't really this, it wasn't really that. We can tell ourselves that, well, you know, that's a particular interpretation, but the fact remains that the authorities of his day saw him as a religious and political threat, and they wanted him dead. And so they killed him. We don't see Jesus that way. Maybe we don't want to see Jesus that way because we like to imagine Jesus here in our churches, safe and tame and kind of neutralized. But I've got to tell you, I think the Jesus that we read about in the New Testament, if you really read your New Testament, would have a lot more in common with the Occupy movement than with what is happening in churches in North America today. Now, some of you know about the Occupy movement. This is a movement that started around the year 2011. The first big movement was Occupy Wall Street. Some of you remember that. Some of you have heard that phrase, the 99% and the 1%. It was a movement for social and political equality. And what it really has become is an attempt to reclaim economy, to reclaim political institutions, to occupy them, to get them back to the original vision and intent. Back to basics. Take back the things that matter. Well, maybe it's time for Christians to occupy Jesus. Jesus came not only to comfort the afflicted, but to afflict the comfortable. And if you don't believe that, then you actually haven't read your New Testament very closely. That is the message that his followers heard. That is the message that Jesus preached to the poor. And by and large today in North America, I am very sorry to say we do not celebrate that Jesus in our churches. That is the movement that grew from a few dozen scared people to a force that threatened an empire. But we have tamed down Jesus. We have made Jesus into a civil Jesus, a gentle Jesus. And in some ways, I'm afraid to say, a very irrelevant Jesus to the kind of people that Jesus would have actually been spending time with. Would we be able to hear the message of Jesus today? I can't answer that question for you, but I'll put it out there. If you're feeling kind of offended by what I've said, think about that question. Would we be able to hear the message of Jesus today? Or would we want him dead too? I believe that the church needs to occupy Jesus. I believe that the church needs to get back to that message which changed lives and which threatened to change the world. And if we could do that, we would have no worries about our pews growing empty. We would have no worries about our future. If we could get back to that message that Jesus brought, that changed people's lives and threatened to change the world. Well, I'm going to have to leave you hanging today, because if you come back next week, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about what that message was, why it was so threatening that it got Jesus nailed to a cross. But for now, maybe we can think about the real Jesus. Maybe we can think about our need to rediscover that real Jesus. Maybe we can think about taking the original Jesus back. Maybe we can think about occupying Jesus.